So this is actually another one of those wonderful terms that Shelley Krimsky talked about in Hormonal Chaos, because he understood that the scientists really had to be advocates. They couldn't just stay in the laboratory and hope that their papers would get widespread. And this is actually what a lot of sociologists of science understand, that all scientists, Bruno Latour studied this, at some very famous laboratories. You've got to take your work and promote it. You can't just wait for it to somehow get filtered into the mainstream. And so there's always this idea that scientists are these completely neutral people who just publish their papers, but they don't. They actually go around and they try to convince others that you should talk about this in the newspapers, you should give a new appropriation to start a new federal agency, or you should give more money to the National Cancer Institute because of what we're doing. So scientists are always, in a sense, advocates for something or other. And in this case, the advocacy scientists are people working on endocrine disruptors and trying to make sure that more knowledge of that gets out so that we begin to regulate and, when necessary, to ban some of these. And it sometimes scares people that scientists would wind up being advocates, but the truth is that they always are. So this is, in a sense, just saying we're going to call the thing for what it is, that people have always done this. And it's similar to saying what the right wing says, well, these are activist judges. Well, all judges are activists. I mean, if the judge is taking an anti-reproductive rights stand, they're being activists on that side. But why is that not being an activist judge? Well, again, it's sort of like we talked about with judges. Many scholars are activists, although they might not call themselves that. So if you were a sociologist who studied population, demographer, the odds are that you would be supporting some kind of reproductive rights. That doesn't mean you'd be out there demonstrating, but it means that you would think that your data could be widely used by the Guttmacher Institute or by the United Nations, by the World Health Organization, to help spread contraception in places where people wanted to have access to that. And that you wanted to do education around STDs to prevent the spread of HIV and other STDs. That's the kind of activism. It's like we're not just studying what is the rate of HIV in a population of people between this age and of this particular tribal origin. We want to use that information to make the world better, to help prevent disease, prevent problems. If an environmental scientist sees the corals are being bleached and 10% of the corals are only left healthy, they don't want to just study this and say, oh, I've got a great new way of simulating or showing coral bleaching. I've got a great new camera that can go down and get these close-up photos, or I've got a new sampling method that's wonderful to find out what nutrients are dumping into the waters nearby that are causing this. I want to use this for a practical reason. And the truth is that most scientists, whether they be social scientists, life scientists, natural scientists, are doing this. But they don't always want to say that. They have a real problem with that boundary. Having come from a long history of activism from the time I was in high school, I can't separate my life out. I can't make up data, but I can say that I will look for objective data that will help people, that will make their lives better. And I really think that more of that should be done, and more of it, often is done. I work on a lot of projects that are funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, one of the NIH institutes. And they've always funded, for many years, these kinds of projects that are literally collaborations of scientists and activists and sometimes government units as well. And they believe that when you put those people together, they can identify problems and work on them together and produce a lot of really excellent science as well as help people. One of the groups I work with a lot is Silent Spring Institute in Newton, and they were founded by the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, which clearly is an activist group. They are a scientific body, but in their mission statement, it says that they are doing work with citizens, with citizen input, for the benefit of everybody. And that hasn't tainted their science the way some people say. It actually has made them leaders in science. They have been some of the greatest scholars of exposure science, finding out what chemicals are in our bodies, our household air and dust. Their findings have led to important policy implications. They've never, they've never made up data to do this. They've never gone outside the bounds of the best scientific journals. Indeed, they've published in the American Journal of Public Health, which is the single premier journal of public health. They published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is the top environmental health journal in the world. They've done great science while doing it in collaboration with activists. And so that's what we want to show as advocacy scientists, that this doesn't mean you go off and just write pamphlets or give interviews to newspapers. It means you do really good science, because if you go back to popular epidemiology, it was the people at the creekside who saw the fish spill. It was the workers in the factory who saw that a lot of people were having miscarriages. It's the people who suffer the problems who call it to attention. And nothing at all in the history of medicine and public health goes against that grain. It's always the ordinary citizens who understand the primary problems. So this is nothing but an extension of that. I think what we just discussed, this question about advocacy science, to what extent should a social scientist be out there in these kinds of collaborations, or even being, members of some of the organizations that they work with? I have never suffered for it. I mean, I've heard criticisms of it. I wouldn't say it's hurt my career. I think that a junior faculty member might be reluctant to do the kind of things that I did. But I think, again, it's also become more acceptable. And many other funding agencies have now begun to fund this kind of community-based participatory research. So not just the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, EPA has done some of this, and now some of the institute-wide calls for proposals from the National Institutes of Health have done this. You even look at an organization like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a lot of projects that call for citizen collaboration. So it's become increasingly important, and those of us who are the groundbreakers, taking risks at doing it, have helped to open it up so it's more legitimate for a lot of people, including junior faculty. So I've seen, very pleased to see young assistant professors fresh out of graduate school applying for and getting those kind of grants and saying, these are prestigious grants and they are really highly recognizable, and I will do work that will be published in the best of journals, but I will do this working with citizens groups. Well, as we saw in the Bush administration, science was very politicized, so that if you were at all on the side of regulation, you were tossed out. And even things that were written into federal laws were not being complied with. So EPA had certain mandates under the Clean Air Act to look every 5 years at air pollution and publish those reports, and those reports were then supposed to be used for future policy making. The administration shut that down. Scientists were kicked off advisory boards because corporations and industry associations and right-wing think tanks said, oh, this person, is an advocate, they're biased, they automatically believe that secondhand smoke is dangerous without looking at the scientific evidence. And so people were kicked off because they were strong proponents of secondhand smoke being a cause of disease. So if you politicize the agencies, the advisory boards, and you take material off the websites, which was true, EPA, was throwing stuff off of its website because they didn't want public awareness of that. All of this work that was done in the Bush administration to politicize science and to deregulate, that we can't have that happen again. We've got to have science-based policy so that when science discovers that smaller air particulate matter is a cause of disease, we have to regulate those smaller particulates. We don't want to see corporations going in and filing suits against the scientists and getting personal records of participants in biomedical research studies and shutting down scientists because they don't like what they're doing. And this happened. My colleague Steve Wing, an epidemiologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, studied the negative effects of hog farming, huge industrial confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs. And he was, really assaulted. The hog industry went to the state legislature and said, look, this is a big industry in our state, and Steve Wing is hurting it. And they forced him to hand over records that should have been private.